Hi, my name is Francisco Tolmasky, and I'm not going to be talking about transpiling JS. If that's in the schedule, the speaker says the real name of my talk, which is The Browser Isn't Feature Complete. But surprise, I'm not talking about that either. I actually didn't change my talk for like a third time. I just came up with a better name. At the time, I thought of this name as just kind of a jumble of ideas, and it was the best thing I could come up with. But this is what I actually want to talk about. And it is the internet as an incremental skill, and it's kind of about like my journey in becoming a programmer through the web. And the original inspiration for this came from another talk by David Nolan, and it's a talk about ClojureScript. Actually, he gave it at Texas.js, but at the beginning of his talk, he focused a lot on the importance of consoles and how that was super important in him becoming a programmer. Specifically, I think his first computer was like an Apple II or something, and that thing fundamentally worked like a console in that like the way you interacted with it was basically programming, and how he feels that consoles are important today still. And I agree with that because even though my first computer was not an Apple II, I also kind of started with computers with a console, only my console looked like this. But that's a lie, right? My console actually looked like this. Yeah, my girlfriend actually like went and installed OS 9 and Netscape 7 just to get that screenshot, so there you go. And yeah, back then there was no console, right? Like literally everything had to be like a stream of alerts, and there was no like disable any more alerts, so it was a fun time to program. But so I kind of want to take you back to this time, which was around 1998, 99, and give you a sense of how I kind of developed my programming skills through just kind of using the web. So at the time I was like a teenager, and teenagers have things to say, and one of the outlets to say stuff is LiveJournal. For me, it wasn't actually LiveJournal. For me, it was the Mac Addict forums, because I was super pissed that they made iTools like a pay service after they promised us it would be free for life. So Mac Addict. And then later on, another way to express yourself was, of course, MySpace. And the really interesting thing about like these services, these like, I don't know what to call them, social/talkie services, was that at the time, we hadn't really made like really nice in-browser editors, right? Or like WYSIWYG, like, make things bold or whatever. And either by design, like in LiveJournal's case, or by accident in MySpace's case, people started to figure out that you can make your post more interesting if you use kind of this magic text called HTML. So, if you went and posted on lots of forums, they weren't sanitizing HTML yet, so you could like kind of throw in some tags and like, things would start doing crazy stuff. Or in the case of like MySpace, you could like change the entire page, right? And this was really interesting, in my opinion, because it's a kind of a cool approach to a problem that I think is really hard, which is syntax. I think if you're a programmer, you kind of forget how hard the initial syntax steps are of like, you really got to make that thing 100% correct or the computer's just going to do nothing. And this was very different, right? Because HTML is really forgiving. So when you went and you were kind of like just copy pasting random things from like either view source, or your friend would say like, hey, if you paste this into like your MySpace, it'll turn your background into like some crazy image. You could kind of get away with not getting it 100% right, and more importantly, not fully understanding even what you're doing, right? Someone pastes you something, you put it in, it's kind of like a little piece of magic that you put into this existing site. And also, like, HTML was a lot easier back then, right? Like, I think this really speaks to a lot of people who aren't programmers, right? Like, a lot of people know what fonts are, so if I say font color equals red, like, they kind of get the sense that that'll make it red, and they don't even need to close the tag, and if you want it to be black later, you just open a new tag and just keep opening tags and whatever, right? And the coolest part about this was that like that's not the end of like the journey, right? Like at some point someone figured out that there's even more magical tags. You can kind of add this on-click thing, and then it might actually do some dynamic things, right? So going from kind of like just posting nonsense on the web to like posting nonsense that like does crazy stuff was kind of like this really easy incremental step. And if you then wanted to take kind of the next step and like, just having a LiveJournal or whatever wasn't enough, that was also kind of easy, right? Because there were like these services like GeoCities, or if you like went to college, like, they gave you a free like place to host your site, or I don't know if this is true anymore, but like at least at this time, every ISP kind of also gave you like a free website or whatever. Like ours was Adelphia, but like people had their AOL pages or whatever. And so going from kind of just learning to throw HTML at like existing websites to making your own website was also kind of easy, especially because, again, HTML is really forgiving, and kind of like any string is more or less valid HTML. So you could like grab like the HTML right from a post and put it in like a document, and that would be kind of the start of a web page. And you didn't really need to understand anything about servers or anything. Like I remember when I was doing this, like the way it worked was it was just like literally like a file upload button, and you would upload your HTML files, and that's actually how I learned about zip files. Like I came from a Mac world, and it was all stuff at Expander, and like I was like, why can't I upload folders? This is ridiculous technology. And someone's like, no, zips, man. Oh, okay. So this process was like really natural. And a lot of my friends had websites, a lot more than I think would today, actually. And in fact, even my dad, who doesn't do anything in technology at all, he's a microbiologist, also had a website. And again, his understanding was this kind of gray area of like, I've stolen different parts from different sites and kind of put this thing together. And this would be like before the age of minification, so that still kind of worked, right? That was still like feasible. And then the best part of all, right, is that once you had this thing on a server, a lot of servers already had like PHP installed. So there's this other, even more magical tag that did kind of more stuff. So this transition was like really natural, right? Like the font tag, which I totally understand, right? Like, oh, I can set a color. To like onClick, which like kind of speaks to me. Well, what is it going to do? Well, onClick, it'll do something. To like this kind of crazy tag that like will do servery stuff. And that's definitely the way I felt about those things. Like, oh, I didn't like really fully understand what was going on with the PHP, but like I could copy paste enough to get by. And so this is kind of what I call this incremental skill, where like going from doing easy stuff to hard stuff is kind of like a spectrum. And there's kind of a lot of really interesting properties about each step in the spectrum. Each step kind of builds from the last, right? And each step kind of like is perhaps a little harder than it needs to be. Again, like posting in like a live journal with like HTML tags is definitely harder than using like a really nice web editor. But that little bit of learning kind of pays dividends later because it puts your foot into like the next step. And not only that, but each step is also like its own conclusion, if you want, right? Like if you stop in the middle, it's fine. Like you haven't wasted any time. Like any one of these steps, if that's like the end of your journey, you still have like a lot of really useful, I guess, skills to do exactly those things that you tried to do. So basically each step kind of like adds immediate value now. So another way to think about it is kind of like, going from reading the web to writing the web is kind of this natural transition. And then another way to look at it is kind of like you start up as a user and then you kind of abuse the web, right? Like you find ways to like change things in your sites and eventually you create with the web. And then perhaps a more politically correct way is to say you're kind of like a pro user. And once I kind of started thinking about that process of learning to program that I went through, I kind of saw it in a lot of other things. And the other big one I saw it in was TI calculators, which was kind of the other big way I learned how to program. And math class at some point, you got to shell out $100 and buy this thing. And the really cool thing about TI calculators is that it kind of has this different, accidental, super successful approach to syntax, which is that every line that you type into the calculator to get a result is actually a valid line of BASIC. And you don't even know that when you're using it. And so even if you're not programming, you're starting to get a handle for what the computer wants, right? Like if you just have one line of code or one line of, math, and you forget a parentheses or something and you get an error, you start to build this intuition for like, oh, I really do need to always close my parentheses, right? And it's really easy to deal with the error when it's just one line, as opposed to like if you're just learning programming, you've got 10 lines and it's like error, and you're like, oh, no, I don't know, right? Like here, you type one line, it says, then you go back, like, okay, I see. And the tricks you learn in like building or like using the calculator again, kind of help you secretly become kind of a programmer, right? Like one of the first steps in like becoming a better TI-83 user is that, hey, you know, the first time you get like a problem wrong because like you duplicated the same thing twice, right, in that second line, instead of storing it to a variable, then it's eventually someone's like, no, just store it, and then then you can use it later. And you've just kind of accidentally learned variables, right? And then something happens where you discover that TI programs can have, or sorry, TI calculators can have programs. Either that's because your teacher's like, hey, download this math program, or more likely because you download Tetris. But the second like the spark goes off in your mind that TI calculators have programs, there's always some crafty student in the class who figures out that, okay, fine, programs, but you know what? Programs are just kind of this place where you can write text. I don't know what a program necessarily does, but I know I can use it to cheat, right? And the crazy thing about this is that this is almost a functioning program, right? Like what you've done is just typed in a formula, but the step from going like, hey, I can use my calculator to cheat, to, hey, the calculator can cheat for me, is not that big of a step, right? So I think this like definitely follows this kind of like same spectrum, right? Like there's this definite like abuse section in the middle, and then you start off just using it. And then by the end, you've kind of accidentally learned how to program, not because you set out to be a programmer, but because at every single step, you were offered a little bit of value if you just put in a little bit of work. And I kind of want to compare that to like, you know, if you say I'm going to become a programmer, and then like if you stop after like class 2 of like an online class, you know how to draw a bunch of circles or something, as opposed to like, no, I have like if you stop at the Tetris stage, then you know how to use the calculator, you know how to store variables, and you know how to play Tetris, as opposed to like having this weird random, I know how to draw circles in this one API like skill. Yeah, again, so user, pro user, and creator, and kind of what I want to get across is that that middle section I think is super important, this kind of like making people pro users before they become creators. Sure, lots of people have heard of HyperCard. This is a system that was designed, I think, very much with this kind of incremental step in mind. You start off using HyperCard as kind of just like a note-taking program, and then very slowly you can add features like, oh, I have lots of cards, I can add some navigation and stuff, and kind of incrementally end up with like a fully functioning program. And then, obviously, I think reading and writing is the best example of this kind of incremental thing where it's really hard to learn how to read without also learning how to write, right? You know, just you learn the letters, you learn how to read, and you can probably throw together a sign that says like sale coffee or something, even if it's kind of misspelled, again, in the same way that even like if you use the wrong HTML tags or you don't do everything 100% correct, you can still start getting value out of it really early. So I want to compare this kind of like, I don't know, strategy of learning or method of learning to something else which I call the like appliance style of learning. And I want to like stress right at the beginning that obviously I'm talking about incremental skills, so that's where my bias is going to show. But I don't want you to consider these as like good versus bad. I think each has its value. I just want to compare them and contrast them. So if this is like incremental skill, this is what appliance looks like to me. And basically, it's not a spectrum. There's like huge gaps that require like lots of activation energy, either like, you know, personally actually really wanting to do something, or, you know, might be just expensive to take the next step or whatever. And I think like a good example of this is a microwave. Nothing you really learn from a microwave kind of sets you on the path to being a cook, right? Like learning the buttons does not prepare you for anything. Like learning that you shouldn't put metal in there doesn't really have like overriding implications. At least I don't think so, I hope not. So if we think of like cooking as kind of this appliance model, you know, somewhere between, you know, my mom makes me food and like I'm cooking a 5-course meal, the microwave is somewhere in the middle, but it's not very smoothly in the middle. You know, using Postmates is somewhere in the middle too, but if you want to take the next step to actually cook, you're probably going to have to buy a whole bunch of new tools and learn a whole bunch of unrelated things, right? And so I just want to quickly give you my nightmare scenario, which is what programming may look like in the future, which is, you know, you're given an iPad, congratulations, you know, family's rich. You have things to say, so you download the Medium app. and you start, saying whatever. And then, I don't know, by some miracle, I guess, you become interested in programming, and then you shell out another $2,000 for a different kind of computer that requires all sorts of different learning curves, and then you pay $999 to get a developer account, and then you're programming, I guess. So I think that in the iOS world, programming feels a lot more like an appliance, where the things you download and use don't really fit in a kind of bigger learning spectrum. They have a very, very focused goal, and then if you want to program, it's very divided. You have to have that kind of personal initiation to say, I want to do this, and start learning it. And I don't really want to this isn't an iOS versus the web thing, because kind of the point of my talk is that I feel that a very similar thing is happening to the web today, and not for bad reasons. Everything is happening for kind of a good reason. In particular, again, I was saying when I was started programming, LiveJournal was kind of the way you did things, and now I think what's happened is we've made the easy stuff way easier, right? Medium.com is way easier to use than oh, you have to learn kind of HTML or something. I think no one can deny that WYSIWYG editors are better for just writing long-form text. You shouldn't have to learn HTML to write long-form text, right? And then the other thing that's happened is all those things that I've kind of described as benefits of early HTML were also kind of hindrances, right? We really cleaned HTML up, and we made it a lot better, and we made the technologies much more powerful. So we've made the hard stuff way harder. And my dad could figure out font color equals red, but I don't think he really knows what a span is. What's a span? And span style equals color colon red. All that stuff is way harder, right? And definitely setting up a Node.js server is way harder than PHP. And if you want to take a Code Academy class, again, you have to sign up and you have to decide, I am becoming a programmer, right? So all this stuff is good. It's just that I feel that the web is becoming more like this appliance model, where there's now this kind of big gap, and I don't think people are kind of building these kind of in-between skills where they may end up kind of accidentally becoming a programmer like I did. And I think that's fine as long as we fill in that gap, right? And the reason I originally named this talk, the browser is not feature complete, is that I really feel that the browser is what can fill in this gap. And so to kind of explain what I mean by that, I just want to give you a really super concise and narrowly focused history of the browser. Again, that's Netscape 7, and this was kind of peak browser feature. This browser had an email client, a news client, a mail client, a Netscape mail versus normal email, an address book, an IRC client, and it had AOL Instant Messenger built in, it had radio built in, right? It had all sorts of things. And generally people decided this was a bad thing. This was a super slow browser, it was really clumsy, it was pretty bad. And so the response to that was Phoenix, which was later renamed Firefox, I think, for legal reasons or something. But the response was to say, hey, it's a browser. It's just meant to browse things, not I don't know, listen to radio and talk on AOL and stuff. Let's make the content shine. Let's focus on engine stuff versus browser features. So, again, we made HTML5 and JavaScript way better. We added all sorts of really cool developer tools to, again, help the core of the browsing experience as opposed to all this surrounding stuff. We had things like Chrome, which did the multi-process stuff, and we started even considering all sorts of cool new technologies. And I think this kind of set the pace of where the way we think about the browser was headed for a long time, up until today, right? You can definitely see this with mobile Safari. This is what it looked like in the original version, and this is what it looks like now. And as you can see, we've kind of get that browser out of there, right? Let's just have the content, and that's even more true in a rotated mode. There's just no browser at all. Finally got rid of the browser, right? We can finally look at just the website. And this is also true of desktop, right? And this is really interesting when you start to think of the browser this way as this basically minimum viable browser, right? It's particularly interesting because it adds kind of a new layer of understanding to a discussion that was very prevalent the last time I spoke at JSConf years ago, which was native versus web. If you kind of think of the browser as not doing anything above just delivering the website correctly, it makes this kind of a really tough argument for the website, right? Like, you end up with like these really abstract reasons for why the web is better, like it's open, right? It's kept harping, it's open, it's open. It doesn't really mean anything to like a user. You also end up with kind of like developer reasons, like, oh hey, like, you know, I can ship to every single platform really easily. It's, you know, that's not such a great user reason either. Whereas like the native arguments are really obvious, like it's way faster, right? Way faster, and it looks like it fits into the rest of your OS. And not only that, but you can make a bunch of money if you do it, right? Like, so what I remember pretty clearly is that really, unfortunately, the argument became open versus good, which was always going to be a losing argument. And that sucks, because that's never the reason I really like the web. Like, I don't particularly care about those abstract reasons. Let me tell you why I like the web, and let me do that through a series of native experiences I've had. This is iPad, right? I'm looking for a drawing app because, I don't know, the new pencil's coming out. And this is what I get. So every time I want to look at a different app, I get this like horrible modal experience that I have to keep going back and forth in. And if I just had like tabs, so I could like open them all up, and then later if I want to do a different search, I don't lose these and I can come back to them, that would be pretty cool. It's too bad we have to wait for this programmer to implement them on their own. And did you notice something else? These are just like the worst search results possible, right? Like none of like Adobe Sketch isn't there. I couldn't possibly be interested in the most popular drawing app, right? No. Wouldn't it be cool if like the way an iPad app was fundamentally made was semantic, so that you could put two different kinds of apps together, one could understand the other, and the one that focuses really well on search could give you way better search results? I guess we just have to wait until Apple gets really good at search. So this is Spotify, and you know, rocking out to Jurassic World, had that thing, you know, just nonstop for a while. So I'm really curious about the songs I was listening to before this, because again, I just had everything on repeat. So I'm not really sure where like the history is. So step one is, of course, I go into the forum and where do I find like how to look at the songs I listen to? Well, you click on that, I don't know, triple equals button or something. I think it's an homage to JavaScript. And then you click on history. But joke's on you, it only goes back 50 items. So since you've been listening to Lost World this whole time, you're never going to know, right? Wouldn't it be cool if there was like a system history where I could decide how long and how far back it goes? That way, it's not up to me somehow making a feature request to please make it go from 50 to 100 or something ridiculous, right? Here's another experience. I'm on the Apple Store, or in the App Store, sorry, and I really want to share this app with someone else, give them a hint that maybe they should buy it for me. I'm not really sure how to do that. Well, if you look hard enough, you'll see that if you click there, there's a copy link button. There's share on Twitter, share to Facebook. I have no idea what tell a friend does. I have no idea. But what if you could use your existing skills to kind of copy something that you could send to someone, so you don't have to like always be finding the unique way to share with every particular app, right? Or here's another idea. My grandma calls me and she really wants to know how to get to her albums in iPhoto. I really, really wish I could just respond with, hey, just click that, okay? So leave me alone. Just if you click that, it'll take you to your albums. Or even better, if there was like some sort of like system intelligent find where my grandma could just type in albums, and even if it's a UI item, like it still would show up in the find, then she wouldn't even have to call me, right? These are the reasons I like the web, right? This stuff. It's not really like JavaScript, right, or HTML. Like those things are great, but that's not really what makes the web, in my opinion. It's these things that are kind of like incremental skills. And these aren't new ideas, right? Like the whole idea behind discoverability was this, right? Like that there are things that you put in that people can discover that then pay dividends forever afterwards, right? And in fact, there are some things that are so important, right? When we were first making like UI computers, that we said we shouldn't even leave it up to the application makers. They should be at the system level, right? Like if we handle copy-paste, then we make sure you only have to learn copy-paste once, right? If we handle like the way you organize apps, you only have to learn that once. If you learn files, then you can like use apps together. And I really fundamentally believe that, you know, it's been 30 years since we came up with these original concepts, that we can graduate and kind of add this new layer. I think that in the past 30 years, we've observed how people want to use computers, and the fundamentals that the browser gives you really handle these new behaviors really well, right? Like, people want to share stuff, right? Things should be shareable by default, not if you happen to put the share button in, right? Like, people really want to be able to like kind of duplicate their screen. Everything should have tabs. It shouldn't be up to like us to implement tabs, right? Like, find should just work across everything, whether it's a button or whether it's content. And the really cool thing about like kind of this proposal of these kind of like behaviors that sit in between here is that they all fundamentally rely on these two core technologies: plain text delivery and the URL, right? How does history work? It just keeps a list of URLs. How does search in history work? Well, it keeps a list of URLs and it can search the plain text, right? Like, how does find in page work? Well, thankfully, since it's plain text, you can find it, right? And this is what I think makes the web, right? Like, if we had like shipped the web using S expressions instead of HTML and Python instead of JavaScript, the web would still be the web because of this. So I think there's like a big problem in everything I'm saying, right? Or elephant in the room or something. If it's true that these things are so amazing, right, the history and tabs and everything, then why aren't people kind of missing it, right? Why don't people miss it when they go and use the native thing, right? Do you guys remember when we first got the first iPhone? It didn't have copy-paste. And you were like staring at your phone at this piece of text and thinking to yourself, am I honestly going to have to memorize this like a caveman and then retype it into text messages? Like, they were livid. And so we got copy-paste. Why aren't people like crying out for history? Why aren't people crying out for tabs, right? So one idea is that, oh, you know, maybe since we went from like desktop to mobile, these like ideas don't really make that much sense there. But I don't think that's true, right? Like, I think the proliferation of the send box to heaven button should be a clear indication that people want sharing and all these things. So I think the reason people aren't clamoring for these features is that, you know, I just sat here and gave you this very ideal view of like history and stuff. But the reality is that's what history actually looks like, right? It's horrible. It's like if you're a Cocoa programmer, you know that this is literally taking a table view, dragging it, and thank God they remembered to resize it to fit the window, because that's about all the work they did, right? And if I do a search, which is buried at the bottom right, oh, hey, 3,000 matches. Was that full text search? Is it just title on the screen? I don't know. You figure it out. You bought the computer. I don't know, right? Like, the only incremental skill to learn here is to remember to delete your history before you give it to someone else, right? Like, that's it. If you just think about it for half a second, right? Like, it's crazy. We live in an era where quite possibly the smartest minds are, as we speak, working on determining your browsing behavior, right? The NSA, ISPs, ads, and even the college I go to knows more about my browsing history than I do. And that's a whole other discussion whether they should be like snooping on me or not. Whatever, that's a different discussion. But at least, if you're gonna have all this data on me, make it available to me. At least let me also have a chance to like be able to search for my history in a good way, right? So I kind of want to give you an alternative view of what history could be like. And so it's kind of just a quick redesign. And this isn't so important right now. The big ideas here are just like, hey, we don't need to see 800 items in one page, right? Google doesn't do that. You only need to see a couple. You can scroll to see the rest. It'd be really nice if I could actually see the page and have a good idea that it's full text search or whatever. But even this isn't like the biggest deal. So again, there you go. The big deal for me is once you have like a really great foundation for history, you can start doing this kind of composition, right? So the one I'm really interested in is, you know, composing HTML5 with history. So I was looking at this really awesome making of Jurassic World thing, because it puts together the best things ever, dinosaurs and computers. And this happens to me a lot. I could have sworn I've seen this video, but when I do search for it, it doesn't come up, right? And the way I search is, you know, Jurassic World YouTube, because that's where I probably saw it. Now, the browser knows what sites have videos, right? That's the whole point of semantic stuff, right? The video tag. So why not record when a site has video, so then I can make a more reasonable kind of search, right? I can do something like this, and oh, that's why it didn't come up, because it was a Vimeo site, and I don't take the time to memorize the different brands, right? So if the browser knows about video tags, it can expose that to me in a way that's more incremental, right? It lets me know that it has some sort of knowledge about video without having me know necessarily about HTML5, right? And again, the browser also knows a bunch of semantic information, so let's just go ahead and show you the poster images so I don't have to play Where's Waldo with this thing, right? And you can do kind of the same thing with audio, right? If you have audio tags, that's even more powerful in my opinion because it's much more likely that you're listening to lots of different audio sources. And so I was listening to a song. I don't really know the name, so I don't put a search thing in there. I just select music, and of course I just get like the songs I listen to, again, determined by the audio tag in descending order of time. And again, the really cool thing about Semantic is that information is that it knows where the file lives, right? So why not make that available to me and just let me play them, right? And just store the string URL. And now I can kind of search the music by sound instead of like having to try to remember the name of the song or whatever, which again, it's probably not very likely because things just play and just go to the next song or whatever. So I feel if history looked something more like that, then you would all of a sudden start seeing people who missed history when you went to native, right? Like they'd say, hey, I was listening to music in these 3 different iOS apps, and I want to know what song it is. I now think it's ridiculous that I have to open up 3 iOS apps and check all 3, which is the way we felt with copy-paste, where we said, hey, I had a good solution for copy-paste, now I don't anymore, right? And in my opinion, I think the discussion would be more mirrored, where like it would be more trade-off-y, like, hey, you know, with native you might get fast, but you don't get all these other nice features. And more importantly, I think that that gives you the opportunity to build these pro users, right? I can't really go to my dad and try to get him on board with like the audio tag or the video tag. It doesn't mean anything to him, he doesn't care. However, if in his music search, one of the results doesn't have a play button because it uses Flash for music instead of, you know, the audio tag, he will get upset and possibly tell the site, hey, your site's broken, it doesn't work here, right? This is what I mean by kind of like the benefit of these pro users. You've just created a secret HTML5 advocate without him knowing it. He's starting to build this idea that the web works in certain ways. And again, that may have different returns. He may just go and complain to the site, but he may also go and try to help the site implement that. Like I've seen that happen, right? Like if you look at Cocoa apps, like people really like to go and write the localization files for people. Is it any surprise that the only open part of a Cocoa app, right, the localization file, is the one that people actually contribute to in droves? And I think like a really great example of that is this site, Wanikani. If you want to check it out, it's for learning Japanese. But they built it in such a way that it's like really tinkerable. And people have gone and made just like thousands of different apps for it. And if you go read the forums, like all the comments are, or many of these are, hey, I've never programmed before, but I really had this itch I wanted to scratch, and this was kind of easy to hack around, and I was able to build this. Again, HyperCard very much had that idea, right? Like every app was like fundamentally editable. You got an app, and you could like change the behaviors of the buttons. And we kind of get that for free with the web, right? You can inspect an element and kind of start understanding how it works. And I think this was also the original vision of the web. Like if you look at Netscape 4, it came with an editor built in, right? And if you look at the original idea of the web, it was for scientists to share, right? Like the idea of shipping a browser that couldn't edit documents was kind of like shipping Microsoft Word without letting you edit. Like it was only doing half its job. And I think it's really unfortunate that the web is becoming more read-only, in my opinion. And that's kind of the reason I wanted to give the talk here at JSConf, because every one of you is a creator, right? And that makes you part of a really cool club. And as a creator, you have a lot more influence than you think, either in the apps you create yourself, like in the example of Wanikani, they've built it in a way that actually inspires their users to kind of become creators themselves, or just in the things you choose to, you know, request out of your browser, right? Like we are the ones who come up with new ideas for browser features and go and bug the developers, right? Usually it's not the like average user. And I think that in our community, we have kind of this general sense that we'd like this club of creators to be bigger. I certainly feel that way. I know I wish I could talk to my dad about the things I do more, and I feel that back then I actually had a better chance of getting stuff across to him, because again, he was like actually building sites and stuff back then, and now he feels like he's very separate from that. It's like, oh, something I have to learn, right? And I think that's a really sad transition to make. I think if we start kind of thinking about this way of teaching stuff, this incremental way, as opposed to kind of these first order approaches, like, oh, how do we make programming languages easier, or how do we teach a class, or whatever. Instead, we kind of think about how can we make the environment itself like more fundamentally incremental. It starts to inform a lot of other discussions we have that we never really thought had anything to do with teaching programming. Like a really good example is good UI. We talk a lot about good UI, like, oh, flat versus skeuomorphic, or Fitts law. But good UI doesn't really mean anything unless you know what it's good for, right? And so if you ask yourself when you're building an app or you're building a browser, like, am I trying to build an appliance? Is this like a one-off? Am I trying to build something that is basically for a user that's at the end of their journey, right? Like they've come in and they're going to do this one task and then they're going to leave and that's it. That means kind of a very different kind of UI than if you're building something more like a calculator, which is something that's at the beginning or the middle of your user's journey, right? And that's it. Thank you.